Great Power by Emrys the Merlin. Chapter 1. Fatal Field Trips. Piper loved school. She really did. She was good at it, too. So smart she really should have advanced several grades in a year, but she refused when the offer was given. But field trips weren't something she looked forward to. If she was honest, she hated field trips. They never went well. Something bad invariably happened to her. The last one she'd been on, she'd fallen out of a 50-story window and found out that her best friend was, at the time, being used as a host for a parasitic symbiote that had some kind of connection to her, along with a mile-long grudge for not letting it take over her mind and turn her into a roaring monster. The time before that, she'd been bitten by a spider, gotten so sick she passed out in her level of Stark Tower, and woken up to find that she was strong beyond belief and could stick to walls. Okay, so that one had ended up working out in the end, but it didn't mean that the experience itself had been any fun at all. Having your DNA broken down and rewritten really, really hurt. But she hadn't been able to find a way to weasel out of this field trip, so she'd resolved to stay at the back of the group and draw as little attention to herself as was humanly possible. But at least the subject matter was interesting. Principal Coulson was leading this trip. Why, no one really knew, but Piper had the suspicion that he was here to make sure nothing went wrong like it had last time, and she was perfectly okay with that. But that didn't mean she trusted him. She followed the group as they followed Coulson through the museum's large arched doorways. She had problems with trusting anyone from S.H.I.E.L.D. these days. The only exceptions were her team, her Auntie Tasha and Uncle Clint. She knew they hadn't had anything to do with her parents' deaths, but the rest of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Well, she just wasn't sure who she could trust anymore, really. That thought sent a pang through her heart as she glanced around and frowned to herself. It had been nearly 2 months since the Venom incident, when Harry had been fully taken over by the symbiote and tried to kill her. Since the world had learned that Tony Stark had a child, though luckily no one had figured out yet that she was that child. The news still liked to talk about that, though, and Harry hadn't been back to school since. He'd finally made contact with someone from their class the other day, that someone being MJ. He'd told her that he was fine and that he would hopefully be coming back to school within the next few weeks. Hopefully. He'd made no mention of Piper or of the symbiote or if he remembered anything. It set Piper on edge just thinking about it. She just hoped he was really all right as the school group made their way into the Norse mythology exhibit. The quotation marks had been added to the name of the exhibit after Thor had landed on Earth. Piper couldn't help but laugh to herself at this exhibit. She had never been to Asgard herself, but Thor loved to tell her stories, and there were so many inaccuracies in the information around her that it made her smile, just a bit. She leaned against a pillar as Principal Coulson, who had to be laughing in his head at this, spoke about the Norse rune in the display case. He had been the first S.H.I.E.L.D. agent to make contact with Thor. Not that anyone but her and her team knew that of those gathered here. But there was a definite smile on his face as he spoke about the mighty Thor. Danny, Ava, Sam, and Luke were towards the front of the class, right next to the case with the stone. The rest of the class dispersed to finish off their worksheets about this section of the museum, and Piper noticed her team draw closer to the stone. Danny spoke as Piper stepped closer to them. He seemed to be translating the text on the stone, which really didn't surprise Piper. Danny was the mythology and spiritual expert of the 5 of them. "Warrior, be afraid of the coming winter?" Then the stone started glowing, a blizzard rising from the display case, and Piper swore. She glanced around and tossed her bag to Eddie Brock, who caught it with little surprise on his face. He'd found out that she was Spider-Girl about 2 months ago. He'd grown used to the fact that trouble seemed to find her like metal filings found a magnet. Coulson called out to the students, "Buddy system, no one gets left behind. Out, now!" He nodded to the 5 of them in the small corner the stone rested in. Their backs were to the wall, the blizzard between them and the door. The case shattered as snow blasted around the room, and the remaining students ran screaming from the room. Eddie nodded to Piper and pulled the door shut behind him, Coulson helping him. Coulson had been beyond angry when he discovered that Eddie knew Piper's secret, but upon finding out that she hadn't told him anything, he was considering training the boy as a shield recruit. The snow swirled and coalesced into a large figure that filled the room, nearly floor to ceiling. Piper flipped out of the way of a large club made of ice it was carrying, which crashed into the floor, leaving the tiles shattered. She landed next to Danny. "You had to read the ancient stone, didn't you?" Danny blushed slightly before falling into a fighting stance with the rest of the team. Piper pulled off her shirt as Ava did the same, revealing their respective costumes. She pulled her mask out of her pocket and pulled it on as Ava dove at the blue giant. She was trying to remember what her Uncle Thor called these things. She'd heard so many stories about Asgard and the other realms that it all blended together after a while. She flipped out of the way of another swing of the club. Nova slipped his helmet out of his bag and took off, blasting the large blue man. Then it blasted ice at Luke, and it clicked in Piper's mind. How the hell did a frost giant get here? The others glanced at her, confused, but then seemed to remember that she'd been living with the Avengers since she was 11, and would clearly have better knowledge about their respective villains than most anyone else. She swung at the thing and kicked it hard in the chest, sending it stumbling, but it batted her out of the air before she could get to the ground. The others cried out as the frost giant squeezed her hard. She groaned and managed to flick a switch on the hidden belt she always wore under her costume. The webs on her suit began to heat up. "Hasn't anyone ever told you I'm too hot to handle?" She quipped as the webs burned hot and the giant screamed and dropped her. It roared and struck out at her. She dove to the side as Nova blasted the thing backwards. Tiger landed on its back, claws digging into blue skin, drawing blood. Iron Fist and Power Man swung their fists in unison, finally knocking the thing off its feet. Its club shattered, and it roared, but before it could rise, a bolt of lightning arced into the room through the domed ceiling. Thor materialized from the lightning, and the team backed off as he brought his hammer down on the giant's head. There was a mighty crack, and the giant moved no more. Piper pulled off her mask, a frown on her face. "You didn't have to kill him. He was down." Thor frowned at her slightly as she and the other teens began to change into their street clothes. "I am sorry this upsets you, but frost giants are monsters that must be put down. It would have gotten back up and done far more damage had I not intervened." Piper stepped up to him with a frown etched into her face. "We had that handled." Thor's frown wavered slightly. "You and your compatriots were doing well, young Lady Piper. But you would have not prevailed against the frost giant. This foe is beyond any of you." Piper rolled her eyes. This was why, despite all the interesting things she learned with Thor, he would never make her favorite uncle in her book. The others were looking starstruck, and she could tell that Thor was loving that. He loved being one of Earth's greatest heroes. But the problem with Earth's greatest heroes was that they tended to forget that there were other people doing this just as well as they did. A fact she was happy to remind almost all of them. She reminded Thor of it now as she stuffed her mask back in her pocket. He had the gall to laugh. "You may yet be one of Earth's greatest champions, but you are a long way away from that goal." She stepped back as the door to the rest of the museum creaked open and Thor turned to the body of the giant. Principal Coulson and Eddie were the first people to stick their heads into the room. But that wasn't what had Piper's attention right now. Her spidey sense was going crazy. She whirled, trying to find the source of the danger, and spotted Thor, reaching for the strange stone on the frost giant's chest. "Thor, don't!" But it was too late. A green cloud of lightning and smoke exploded from the stone, and Piper felt herself scream, even as she heard cries of pain from the rest of her team and her uncle. Then everything went black. Eddie shouted Piper's name as the room was filled with green smoke and lightning. Then a flash of blue-white light, and it cleared, and MJ screamed. The room where Sam, Piper, Ava, Danny, and Luke and Thor had been was now empty. 6 scorch marks, all that was left of the team and the Avenger. Chapter 2. missing. S.H.I.E.L.D. was on the scene in less than 5 minutes, the rest of the Avengers not far behind them. Tony was panicking. He'd gotten the call from Fury that Thor had been fighting a frost giant when something had happened, that his daughter and several of her schoolmates had been in the room at the time, that his daughter was missing. He landed in the museum using the hole Thor must have created to get into the building. The man really had no regard for architecture. Piper's schoolmates were being escorted out of the building and onto the bus. They must have ridden here. Mary Jane was sobbing in Eddie's arms, and Tony's heart clenched. He stepped over to them and stepped out of the armor. "Tell me what happened." It wasn't a request. It almost sounded like he was begging as Captain America and Black Widow ushered the remaining students back onto the bus. One of the guys in a Letterman jacket seemed particularly interested in what was going on, but a glare from Natasha and he was scurrying onto the bus. MJ and Eddie told them what they knew, which wasn't much. Nor was it very heartening. Tony had to restrain himself from marching onto that bus and tearing Coulson apart, at least verbally, for not keeping a better eye on his child. But Piper didn't want the world to know. He didn't want the world to know that she was his daughter. They would never leave her alone if they knew. So instead, he stepped back into the armor as Cap escorted Eddie and MJ back to the bus. "Jarvis, scan the area. Tell me there's something, please." He knew the AI could hear how close to tears he was, and complied quickly. "Sir, there appears to be a vast amount of energy from another world here." Tony frowned. "That'd be from Thor, right?" Tony zoomed in on one of the scorch marks a few feet away from the dead frost giant. "No, sir. The energy appears to be closer to that left behind when an Einstein-Rosen bridge is opened." Hope leapt into his heart as Jarvis zoomed in closer, and he spotted the telltale runic markings in all 6 scorch marks. Tony whooped, surprising everyone in the room. "They aren't dead! They just teleported! They're not dead!" Now he just had to figure out how to get to Asgard to save his daughter from whatever mess Thor had gotten her and her friends into. Piper groaned as cold pulled her back to reality. It hurt. Reality usually did after lightning passed through her, but cold was not a symptom she recognized from that particular attack. She shot to her feet and slipped on a patch of ice. She landed hard on her back and groaned. This seemed to stir another pile of snow, and Sam's head poked out of the drift. He was shivering. He pulled out his helmet, which he had just put away at the museum, and slipped it back on. He shuddered as the snow melted under his glow. Piper drew a bit closer to him as 3 other piles of snow revealed themselves to be her friends. They put their costumes back on, and Piper activated her heating system again. They finally looked around and found that none of them recognized their surroundings. A large gate stood in front of them. One of the doors, which looked like they had once been beautiful gold, was missing. The other was hanging off its giant hinges. She looked around. Someone was missing. "Thor?" She called out, her voice snatched away by the frozen wind. There was a tremble in the snow in front of her, and then a frog, dressed in her uncle's clothes, leapt forth, wielding Thor's hammer. Piper stared. He glanced at her. "What?" The team blinked at him for a moment behind masks before Piper spoke. "Why are you a frog?" He looked down, and a surprised ribbit tore itself from his throat. Piper held back a laugh. "This is impossible! There is but one man who could have conjured such magic. But he is dead!" The ground shook, and Thor looked up and gasped. "Asgard!" He hopped off, and Piper raced after him, the others following close behind. "I thought you said Asgard was a golden city and, warm." Piper questioned as they raced through the snow after the frog that had been her uncle. The frog stopped cold, staring ahead of him. Piper caught up and gasped. In front of them was what had clearly once been a busy market. This was clear because the people were still there, but they were all frozen in solid blocks of ice. Piper swore under her breath and looked around. A woman and her child were frozen a few feet away from them, looks of shock on their faces. Ava was the first to speak, the yellow eyes of her costume fixed on the same ice block Piper was looking at. "Are they dead?" Piper tapped her wrist and her shield watch glowed. She flicked her finger across the screen to some of the things she'd added to the watch and scanned the ice block. "No, they're alive. It's almost like hibernation, but they are alive." The others looked relieved as Piper stepped a bit closer to Nova, shivering even with her heater on in her suit. He seemed to raise an eyebrow at her. "What? There's a reason you don't see spiders outside in winter. We don't like cold. Don't do so well in it either," she commented, and Nova let out a short laugh before Thor the Frog took off towards the large golden palace. Piper swore and took off after him, the others close behind. They heard him cry out as he reached the golden gates of the Palace of Asgard. 2 large ice blocks stood there, one with 3 people in it, another containing a woman with beautiful flowing black hair, a sword in her hand. Piper recognized them from the stories Thor had told her about Lady Sif and the Warriors 3. Thor was croaking out something that sounded like an angry growl. Piper used her watch to scan them. "They're still alive." Thor wasn't to be distracted, though. "The throne of Asgard has been usurped." Piper stepped in front of the frog, scooping him off the ground as she did. He pouted and croaked at her. "Thor, you need to tell us what's going on here. 1 minute we're in a museum, now we're on frozen Asgard, and you're a frog. Context is important." The frog croaked, then nodded. "My brother lives, and has usurped the throne of Asgard." Piper frowned. "How is he alive?" "You said he was stabbed in the chest when the Dark Elves tried to take over." The others were looking at them like they were speaking a different language. She waved them off, holding her uncle, the frog, in one hand. "Aye, he was. But he must have used his magic to survive. Now he has gotten what he wished for all these years. He has claimed the throne of Asgard with the help of the frost giants." Piper frowned, nodding slightly. "What do the frost giants have to do with this, though?" Thor never got to answer her question as the ground shook and ice split, disgorging 3 very angry-looking frost giants. The frog leapt from her hands, and she was instantly struck by a blast of ice from one of the giants. Piper dove to the side of another giant. She turned to her team so they could fight off the threat, maybe figure out a way to save Thor too, but they were already frozen in a solid block of ice. Something struck her in the back, and she felt her body shutting down. Her eyes remained open, though, as one of the giants picked up the small ice block that contained her uncle, another picked up her team, and the last one picked her up. They were carried into the throne room as Piper tried to keep her head on straight. She had to figure out a way out of this, but she couldn't move. Her heater was slowly melting the ice, but not nearly fast enough to do any good. She had no idea how they were going to get out of this.